She sat in my office and, without any preamble, said, "I need a job." The woman who had stood on the bleachers and laughed while a video of me tore through my senior year, the one who had convinced half the school to ignore me, was now asking me for a place on my payroll. Her name was Veronica. She had pushed me into corners at parties, orchestrated fake notes, told teachers I cheated, and then watched as my scholarship evaporated the summer before freshman year. She had done something simple and permanent. She lied. So many people would repeat it until it replaced what actually happened. It cost me college funding, 2 years of deferment working 7 days a week, and a confidence I'd only recently reclaimed. To have her sit under my pendant lights asking for work felt like someone coming back to collect on a debt that had never been repaid. That opening moment, her request, her polite smile, her hands folded like a penitent, is where the story began to unwind for me again. It hurt because the damage wasn't just one night of cruelty. It was a set of choices she made again and again that shaped the path of my life. She took something measurable, something I needed, and she made it disposable. 15 years after she stomped on me in sneakers and a varsity jacket, she expected generosity. The setup to how I found myself in the position to grant or deny her request isn't complicated. My father owned a small chain of apartment buildings on the east side, 14 units spread across 3 brownstones, a parcel of land he'd bought, brick by brick, with a down payment and an unwillingness to quit. I grew up in one of those apartments. When my scholarship was rescinded and my mother had the second stroke, I moved back. I worked nights at a diner and days at a property manager's office. I learned landlord-tenant law out of necessity. When my father's heart failed, the properties were left to me in his will and in a set of paperwork, notarized 2 weeks before he died. The will was simple. I was to manage the properties until the youngest tenant, Mrs. Alvarez, finished her lease. The council of the building's small company, my father's friend from the union, the accountant he trusted, gave me the title and the tax forms. I had to learn to be practical. For 10 years, I ran the portfolio personally. The rent rolls, the maintenance men who called me by my childhood nickname, the careful balancing of HVAC replacements and roof patches. We were never the kind of landlord to raise rents overnight. We fixed things, sometimes at a loss for weeks, because it was cheaper than a bad tenant cycle. When the neighborhood began to change, developers circled, the properties suddenly had value in a way they never had before. Offers came, thoughtful letters arrived, and I said no for reasons that seemed small at the time. Loyalty to old tenants, my father's voice about not selling what you don't have to. Eventually, a local developer made an offer that would let me afford the mortgage on the building where my mother lived and buy out the co-ownership that had been a thorn. I signed the papers. Running the business gave me leverage I didn't have at 18. I could hire, I could fire, I could set budgets. Power in that sense was a set of accounting lines and signatures. But power didn't make me invulnerable. There were obligations that kept me from closing the door on everyone who asked for help. I had payroll to worry about. The city had regulations. Mrs. Alvarez's lease ran 2 more years. I had an assistant, Jonah, who'd worked with my father and who knew the building's history in the same way I did. I had a friend at the bank who approved credit lines for emergency repairs. I had a history with people I could not burn. When Veronica walked in, she was polite. A city sidewalk had erased our teenage differences from her face. She said the right things in the right order. She had been between jobs. She had taken some time to care for a sick parent. She spoke about restructuring her life. She described a gap in her resume with a soft shrug, as if gaps were an accepted currency. She laid out how she could help with leasing and tenant relations because she had a background in hospitality. She knew, she said, how to be persuasive and calm under pressure. I listened. I reviewed her CV. I checked references. The first reference was a name I recognized from a boutique real estate group. The phone number led to a receptionist who confirmed Veronica had done short-term leasing for 3 months. Her second reference came from a woman at a PR firm who said she handled outreach for a nonprofit and that she was a quick study. Those calls were shallow. No one said the kind of thing that lit me up. But there was nothing outwardly fraudulent. People with messy pasts often had polite cover stories. I was not interested in being a gatekeeper of shame. I was cautious. I was curious. That felt like mercy. The first escalation came quickly. Veronica offered soft help for free the first month. She said she wanted to prove herself. She moved through the buildings like someone cataloging people's weaknesses. She asked questions that didn't feel like questions. She noted which tenants paid late, which units showed neglect, who had children, and who worked third shift. She wrote notes in a neat, small script and left them on my assistant's desk with the sort of directness that felt innocent until it wasn't. Jonah read them politely and then didn't bring issues to me in the same way. He began to copy her on internal messages. My reaction was a small, internal tightening. I had given Veronica a chance on the margin, not to humiliate her, and the early signs suggested she was trying to be useful. I told myself to watch and not to judge. A consequence of that inaction was subtle. Veronica began to replace my processes with hers. She streamlined the rent reminder notices, better language, a softer tone, and tenants began to respond to her emails more than mine. She made a few repairs happen faster because she knew how to bargain with contractors. In a month, the vacancy rate ticked down a fraction. It looked like progress. The second escalation was more personal. I found a comment thread under a neighborhood blog post that mentioned my company, and under it was a throwaway line: "Isn't the owner the one who cheated on her scholarship?" It was a line so precise that for a second I felt my chest hollow out. The rumor was a ghost from high school. I'd worked for years to make sure it stayed dead. I checked the poster. It was an account name I didn't know with no history. Veronica hadn't posted it, at least not publicly, but a tenant mentioned later offhand that a former classmate of hers had messaged and asked about my character, someone in another. Building told Jonah that a woman had come by to ask about me, introducing herself as a neighbor, though she left with more information than she had when she arrived. My reaction tightened into an action. I called a meeting with Jonah and told him to lock down internal processes for references and to forward any external inquiries to me first. I reminded myself quietly that the company's lifeblood was stability. I took steps to protect reputations. The consequence, Jonah bristled, and then, subtle as fog, began to avoid giving me direct reports. That created distance in a team of 3. The situation grew worse because distance in a small team looks like sabotage. Everyone imagines their own replacement. A month after that, the escalation loop intensified and took a financial turn. Veronica forwarded me a spreadsheet that reconciled payments for a building. At first glance, it was neat. Columns for dates, notes on repairs, sums that matched my ledger. When I compared it with the bank statements, the numbers didn't line up. Several deposits were listed twice. A reimbursement entry for a vendor showed a larger amount than the check that cleared. I asked Veronica for her source materials. She said she had received them from an auditor she'd worked with. The auditor's name was plausible. The auditor's email was a Gmail address set up 2 years prior. The vendor sent a terse reply when I called. They had received 1 check, not 2. My reaction was to freeze the accounting for the month. That's what anyone with a property portfolio would do when numbers looked wrong. I called the bank and requested microfilm of deposits for the disputed days. The bank's copy showed the real amounts. The consequence was public and small. Tenants received late notices that I hadn't intended to send because I was reconciling accounts. Paperwork piled into the hallway of our small office. Veronica, meanwhile, smiled from across the desk and sent me an email suggesting a company retreat to realign processes. She offered to organize it as if that would smooth things over. It got worse. Jonah was suddenly accused of failing to secure a repair authorization. There was a missing invoice for $1,400 for a boiler repair that I had no record of approving. The vendor swore they'd been paid by check. Our bookkeeper said no check had cleared. When an angry tenant threatened to withhold rent, I walked into the office late at night and found a pile of physical envelopes, notices that had been marked with our company stamp but never mailed. All of this painted a picture of mismanagement. My reaction became defensive. I held an emergency meeting with our bookkeeper and the accountant my father had trusted. We went line by line, and we found that several entries had been manipulated in an attempt to make a missing fund look like an expense properly authorized. The accountant's voice was low on the call, tired. He said, "Someone is doing this deliberately." The consequence was a formal audit, and the audit flagged a pattern of irregular entries that would require a forensic accountant. I knew that the process would be expensive. I knew it would make banks nervous. Meanwhile, Veronica began to escalate socially. She reached out to an old classmate who now wrote for the local paper. The writer, once a part of Veronica's circle, agreed to meet over coffee and wrote an op-ed about landlord transparency that, without naming names, used examples similar to our properties: missing paperwork, tenant complaints, and a suggestion that the owner might be overwhelmed. It was careful. It read like concern, but it landed like a stone. The public pressure nudged a bank officer to call and ask for assurances. A developer who'd been in conversations about buying a unit paused. A tenant queasily asked if payments were still being processed on time. The consequence at this point was reputational. People began to doubt the competence of my stewardship. My reaction was exhaustion. I started responding to things defensively instead of strategically, which made me more vulnerable. The situation got worse because vulnerability looks like guilt. The next betrayal hit a place I had tried to keep private. Years earlier, after the scholarship was taken from me, I had taken a high-interest personal loan to cover my mother's care until the first of my properties sold. I'd kept the loan hidden from everyone because it felt like a confession. My father didn't know, the accountant didn't know. It was a small private failure. Veronica somehow found out. She didn't threaten to use it against me publicly at first. Instead, she mentioned it in conversation with Jonah in a very neutral, almost sympathetic way, as if she'd uncovered a secret by accident. Jonah told me he'd heard a rumor that I had debt beyond the company's liabilities. He didn't know the amount. He only knew the word. My reaction was immediate and sharp. I told Jonah the truth. I told him about the loan and why I'd taken it. The consequence was an unexpected one. Jonah's eyes went soft and he said nothing. He had always been practical, but now, seeing my admission, he stepped back from day-to-day decisions and began to insist that all hiring and wage changes be run by the accountant. The company, which had been lean and fast because decisions were made by 3 people in a small office, slowed to a crawl. The situation worsened because slow decisions cost money. I tried to draw a line. I told Veronica that she could not handle accounting or vendor payments. I offered her a trial, strictly limited, to manage tenant outreach and events with the goal of reducing vacancy time. She accepted with a smile. She was good at it. Within weeks, 2 units that had been empty for months were filled. Tenants praised her. I felt guilty in the way owners sometimes do. Guilt that my suspicion had cost someone a chance. And then a new loop opened. Veronica decided to tell her side of the high school story quietly to someone who listened. She found a woman who once shared a classroom with us and told her the version of our senior year that put me in a bad light. This woman, who was now a property investor, reached out to Jonah and asked if the company had been transparent about past disputes with tenants. Her email was casual. She called me owner with a E, lowercase o. Fresh doubt spread through a small network like a bruise. My reaction was to confront Veronica. I asked why she was revisiting the past. She said, with a calm that smelled like calculation, that she'd had a hard life and she didn't want to be defined by who she had been at 18. She said she had apologized before. In small, private ways, she said she had moved on. When I pressed her about the rumor she had reignited, she shrugged and said she'd only told the truth where she thought it mattered. The consequence was that our earlier detente collapsed. Trust evaporated faster than I could reconstitute it. This time, the fallout reached into my personal life. A bank loan we'd been negotiating to refinance a roof replacement stalled. The underwriting team wanted more documentation. Our accountant insisted we hire a forensic specialist. The cost for that was $8,400 out of pocket. I signed the invoice because I had to keep the roof from leaking in the next storm. That money came from the personal loan I had hoped to keep quiet. When Jonah realized that, he stepped further away. He told me I was overexposed. That exchange made me feel small in a way that took longer to heal than any bruise. The low point arrived, where it always does, at night, with a silence that amplified every small failure. I had been called into a meeting with the board, not a corporate board, just a small circle of people my father had trusted. The accountant, Mr. Caswell from the union, and one of the co-owners who'd never liked me. Veronica wasn't in the room. I sat under a fluorescent light and listened as they read aloud excerpts from the audit and an anonymous note that suggested I had mishandled funds. The co-owner's face was neutral, but there was something like pity in his eyes. Pity makes power shift. They took one thing I had considered untouchable and suggested it was in jeopardy, my management title. They said it was for further review and that they wanted an interim manager appointed while the forensic audit concluded. They suggested the interim might be someone from outside the family, someone neutral. In that moment, I felt my leverage disappear. The company was not large. A few signatures and a board vote could strip me of the legal authority to approve repairs, to sign leases. The thought of walking from the office and having no keys made my hands tremble. I left with a box of my personal items, a mug with an old joke printed on it, a paperweight with my father's name, a yellowing photograph of me and my mother on a stoop. I thought, not for the first time, that the last 15 years of work could be upended, not by an honest challenge, but by a carefully paced campaign of suggestion. I slept that night on the couch in my mother's small living room because I could not face the echo of the property office. The turning point was neither cinematic nor neat. It was a small, stubborn piece of paper left in a file folder I hadn't opened since high school. While cleaning out drawers that felt like they were closing around me, I found a typed note with a pen-scratched margin. It was a note I had kept from our senior year, a draft from the scholarship committee with a notation, allegation received. The note had been where I had put it because at 18 I had hoped for a future and I had not wanted to lose every paper connected to that wish. I had shown it to no one in years. In the margin, in a different, hurried hand, was a name I recognized. Veronica, with a date and a line that read, "Claim plagiarized." The name was followed by a scrawled annotation, "Withdrawn." Seeing that notation was a kind of small reckoning. Withdrawn. Why had it been withdrawn? Because someone had decided they didn't want the paper trail. Because someone had called the committee and convinced them it was unsubstantiated. Because someone had lied and then, when confronted by the risk of an inquiry, had deflected. The paper itself was not proof ripe for a court. It was a reminder that my past was not a single sealed fate. It suggested the possibility that the campaign against me had been manufactured rather than a spontaneous moral verdict. I brought the paper to the accountant, who read it with a slow, precise attention that had nothing to do with sentiment. He said, "This is a note, but it does indicate someone acted." We ran a different kind of audit, not of the bank statements, but of communications. We subpoenaed email trails related to the prior arbitration on tenant disputes. We requested archive messages from the scholarship committee under a public records request. These were small, lawful steps. They felt like moving through molasses, but they produced something concrete. An email thread between a coordinator at the scholarship committee and a woman with a name very similar to Veronica's, dated the week the allegation appeared. The sender apologized for the confusion and wrote that the allegation appeared to be anecdotal and they would take no further action. The email address belonged in the header to an account that had been linked to a salon where Veronica had worked summers 10 years earlier. The path from the handwritten margin to a server log was not instantaneous, but it was real. I did not march into the office and wave documents like a sword. I took the information quietly to a lawyer and asked for options. The lawyer explained the limits. The statute of limitations had long expired for any criminal claim, and civil options were tenuous for something that had been a rumor. We could, however, demand that a certain narrative stop being pushed in the public sphere. We could present the email chain to the board and request they consider the context in a measured way. I chose to do that. I also chose something more personal. I sent Veronica an email asking for a conversation. I did not bring the subpoenaed records. I said I wanted to talk about boundaries and about how to work together. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop I used to walk past with my mother when I still had the scholarship and the next stretch of sunny optimism. At the meeting, I sat quietly and let her talk. She told me about being fired from a corporate role when the company restructured, about a medical debt she had, about a failed attempt to start a catering business. She spoke in a way that made exhaustion sound respectable. Then I asked a single question. Why did you keep saying the things you said in high school? She looked away for a long time. She said that, at 18, the attention she got for being cruel felt like power, and that she had been afraid of being invisible if she didn't keep the center, afraid of not being invited. She said it in a voice that did not ask for absolution. It was a document of motives, not a plea. I listened. When she left, she kissed my cheek in a way that felt like someone trying to retire a debt by affection. The turning point did not make everything right. It gave me a path forward that felt steadier. I presented the email chain and the scholarship note to the board and to our accountant. The board could not ignore that before they had voted to remove my authority, they had not been given the full context. The accountant, who had quietly guarded my father's finances for decades, looked at the chain and then looked at the co-owner who'd been urging caution. The co-owner's expression shifted. He had liked order and narratives that made him comfortable. When presented with evidence that the narrative had been incomplete, he suggested reconvening the vote. In the weeks that followed, the interim manager was never appointed. The forensic audit continued, but with different eyes on it. Someone who'd been skeptical of me asked the right questions. The bank regained its confidence when our books came clean under the second review. A developer withdrew the idea of forcing a sale. I regained the keys to the office. None of this felt like triumph. It felt like relief, like a deep breath after a month of shallow ones. Veronica reacted in ways that were small and predictable. She posted a vague line on her social media about hard lessons, and then took a job across town doing leasing for a construction firm that specialized in student housing. Her job paid less than what I would have paid her, but it gave her stability. A few months later, she was let go after being accused of fudging a report. At the termination meeting, she said she'd been overwhelmed and that she messed up. She did not come to me for help before she was fired, and she did not sue. There was no grand career fallout. There was, instead, a succession of small professional failures that were the natural consequence of a pattern she had never learned to break. The consequences for me were not purely external. In the low months when the board considered stripping my authority, a dear friend I'd grown up with, someone who had been a tenant, then a business ally, then a person who knew my mother, decided to sell his small apartment and move out of town. He said he couldn't risk being tied to an uncertain company. I lost him. I lost engagements with a contractor who'd been more comfortable doing business with a larger, more distant landlord. I incurred medical bills that the stress made worse. There were professional scars, quiet and deep. The payoff, then, was not what I told myself about revenge or justice. The payoff was that the fabric of the place I'd inherited was still intact. I lost friends and time and a measure of peace, but I kept the buildings. They still housed people who needed a roof. I also learned a skill I had refused to practice at 18. The careful defense of reputation. It's not glamorous. It involves filing letters, copying email headers, keeping a ledger of phone calls, and, crucially, documenting conversations. It involves setting up protocols so that one person cannot rewrite a narrative without multiple witnesses. I formalized hiring checks. I insisted that references be verified with direct numbers, that physical documents be scanned and retained. I insisted that Jonah, once he came back from a period of distance, take over as operations manager and that he be given clear responsibilities. He did, slowly, because he trusted that the system would not let one person turn a rumor into a campaign. Years later, Veronica and I crossed paths at a holiday event for a neighbourhood charity. She was folding cloth napkins behind a table, moving with the same careful efficiency she'd once used at our properties. I watched her for a long time, thinking of the ledger that had once been wrong and the letter that had been found in a drawer. I thought of the long arc between the day she made my life harder and the day she sat in my office. I approached and said quietly, "I hope you're doing okay." She looked at me like someone expected to be punished and instead was given a simple sentence. She smiled in a way that was small and not certain. There was no reconciliation scene. There were no apologies that absolved both of us. We did not become friends. We were neighbours in a city where people grow close and drift apart by the small motions of life. I learned not to mistake pity for repair or employment for forgiveness. I learned that power can be measured in signatures and money and bank lines, but also in the ability to set boundaries and hold to them without theatrics. The tangible outcomes were modest and real. Veronica never worked for me again. She never held a high-profile job in the city. My company survived the campaign that had almost undone it. I paid the forensic accountant and the legal fees, and I paid them without spectacle. I repaired the roof. I kept the tenants I cared about. I moved slowly toward a sense of normalcy that included a new protocol for references and a clearer separation between my personal finances and the company's. I also stopped carrying my father's photograph around like a talisman. I placed it in a frame that sat on my desk and looked at it only when I needed to choose a direction. There were private consequences I still feel. I am more suspicious now. I check my email headers. I keep hard copies. I do not speak freely about my past without a reason. Those are small losses, but they matter. They are the cost of learning a lesson by experience rather than by instruction. I do not regret learning it. I would rather have learned in a quieter, less costly way. But regret is not a currency that buys back years. At the end, the story closes not with a dramatic retribution, but with a small, quiet settlement of life. I continue to manage the properties. I hired a woman last year who had once been a tenant and who needed a reference. She's been one of my best assistants. I paid down the personal loan bit by bit. I visit my mother's grave twice a year and clean the stone myself. I answer emails late at night and sometimes cry at the sink because stress catches up to the body. I talk to Jonah about boundaries and about the cost of loyalty. We make decisions together now with more eyes and fewer surprises. If there is a last thing I can say about Veronica, it is that she remains a complication in my life, not a villain in a movie. Like, real people make real choices. Some of those choices hurt others. People can change in small ways or not at all. I do not expect an apology to undo what happened, and I do not need her permission to feel whole. I have found a cautious kind of peace that is not loud and not theatrical, but is earned. If you stayed with me this long, thank you. If you feel like this story resonated in some way, leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe. And I'd like to ask, have you ever had someone from your past come back asking for help? Tell me in the comments if you feel like it.